Thanks so much for sharing your garden with us. And now we're going to be talking about trees and how to take care of all these dying trees around us. There's a big tree die-off going on in Central Texas, and I'm joined by April Rose from the organization TreeFolks. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
We want to talk about good things about trees, but there is kind of a tree crisis going on right now in our region because of the drought. Before we dive in and start talking about spotting trees in trouble and knowing all those things, real briefly describe the mission of TreeFolks.
Yeah. TreeFolks is a local nonprofit organization. We've been around almost 25 years. Each year we plant more than 10,000 trees a year in Central Texas, and we do that largely through our volunteer tree planting events. And we also teach people about why trees are important and how they can take care of trees.
Okay, well, let's talk about taking care of trees. Okay. You know, we are experiencing massive die-off, unlike anything this region has seen since the 1950s, for sure. And the drought is the primary culprit, right? Right.
Yeah, we had exceptional heat in 2011 as well. And so the heat coupled with the drought that year caused an estimated 10% loss of tree canopy statewide.
And when people think about this, we're literally talking about tens of millions of trees.
Yeah, in Austin, we know we have an estimate of how many trees we have on public land based on some inventory data. Of the public trees alone, just public trees along streets and in parks, there's about 300,000. And so from 2011, that translates to about 30,000 trees lost in just that year. But the impacts of drought and heat don't just stop that year.
Right.
That drought and heat stresses trees. It causes them to use their stored carbohydrates, and in subsequent years makes those trees that survived more vulnerable to insects and disease or other subsequent droughts, wind. So the trees that remained and survived are potentially more vulnerable because those drought and heat implications from 11 are still affecting them.
Right. Well, what do people need to be aware of when they look at they step outside their back door, they look at their trees? What are some danger signs they should be aware of that their trees might be in trouble?
They should, you know, people often don't really look up until it's too late. They just kind of take for granted those trees are always going to be there. And it is important to really think about the health of your trees. And if you are looking up and observing changes in the tree canopy, you are more likely to catch something early on when you can affect change. So the kinds of things you could look for would be yellowed leaves, scorched leaves, even a decrease in leaf size. So sometimes as a tree is more and more stressed, the average leaf size will decrease. Dieback, where you're seeing more and more twigs as opposed to leaves, so twig dieback, which would lead eventually to limb dieback, is a very obvious sign. And then also wounds along the trunk.
Cavities in the trunk,
Yeah, all of that can be signs of things that may or may not be directly related to the drought, but could contribute to weakening a tree. And so it's things to look at and note, and then ask an arborist to come out and help you determine what can you do to take more proactive care of your tree.
And one of the things I always advocate for is that when you say being proactive about trees, is looking at the architecture, if you will, of the trees. Are there some branches that look really out of sorts? I mean, are they leaning out in precarious ways?
Yeah.
It might call for preventative pruning, right?
Absolutely. Structural pruning, training pruning, pruning for clearance. There's a lot of good reasons to prune trees that are more likely in an urban area than obviously in a wooded setting where there aren't as many obstacles like houses and power lines and pedestrians.
Or pedestrians or cars and driveways.
Exactly. And so if people, they can learn pruning on their own and they can do it themselves, or they should hire an arborist if they feel that it's beyond their safety capacity. But a little bit of preventative structural pruning regularly will help ensure that the wound size is minimized. You can make smaller minor corrections early on to maximize the structure, the architectural
and it'll
strength
cost a lot less
of the canopy. It'll cost much less. The tree is more likely to be able to seal off that wound if it's smaller. And so over the long term, you're going to promote the strongest canopy that's going to be the most resilient to the stresses of wind. And so really proactive intermittent pruning is a very good investment.
Okay, there are other things that we can do that are proactive that really help the general health of the tree and help sustain it over time. You know, most urban settings, and suburban for that matter, are not the landscape is not really friendly to trees. We have turf, which we water just deep enough so that the turf survives, and we don't allow leaf litter or things like that, which trees really depend on, right?
Absolutely. You think about the urban environment where some trees were preserved during construction, but often many of the trees that we see today in our landscapes are planted. So in the construction process, often soils are removed and brought in and or compacted. And so you're often dealing with a real diminished product to begin with. The growing medium is often not very supportive to nurture our trees. And without a really good, healthy growing medium, we can't really expect our trees to be vigorous and to thrive. And so it's important to try to nurture that growing medium by proactively mulching and watering and doing what we can to really encourage healthy macro and microinvertebrate populations in the soil.
The life of the soil, very simply. Organic matter, compost tea, use it. Very simply. Okay. Now, we don't want to be all doom and gloom here. And this is, the autumn is tree planting time in Central Texas. And even for those people with trees, planting the next generation, even while the big trees are still there, perhaps, is a good idea, right?
Yeah, I did the very same thing last October. I have American sycamore in my front yard that was planted in the 50s. I'm starting to see some signs that that tree may not be around for probably another 10 years. I went ahead and planted an 18-inch sapling next to that tree because I'm preparing for the future. It's important that we do plant today because the trees are not going to be there forever. Eventually, they will die. And so it's important that we plant trees now so that when trees do die due to drought or just natural decline, that we have things that are coming up in the landscape so that they can provide shade more quickly.
Exactly. And there are entire neighborhoods where trees are dying, where, say, for example, Arizona ash was the tree of the moment, and now all of those ashes are dying. So the secondary trees are critically important. Now, you've brought some trees for us to look at, and I want to highlight these because there are a lot of good choices. Everybody wants a fast-growing tree, and they also want a healthy tree. A tree that kind of matches both of those characteristics is the Monterey oak. And this is one that is native to the western regions of the hill country and does great here, right?
It does. It's a great alternative to live oak because in most winters it will remain evergreen. Occasionally in a very cold winter it may shed all of its leaves, but it is considered tardily deciduous or mostly evergreen.
I love that.
It's also resistant to oak wilt. So it's a great choice as another evergreen oak tree to add diversity in the landscape to mitigate the potential impact of oak wilt.
I think they're very handsome trees too.
They
I love
are.
the foliage.
And we've been planting them now in the Austin area for almost 20 years. And so we've really seen them do great through the drought, and they've proven themselves in the Central Texas landscape. Well,
I mentioned Arizona ash a moment ago. You also brought a Texas ash, and this, I have to say, is one of the best specimens of Texas ash I've ever seen in a pot. I kind of want you to leave it here accidentally, but these are great trees, well suited to the hill country as well as the eastern part of our region, I think, and then also great fall color.
Yes, they're adaptable as well, just like the Monterey oak. They'll do well in all parts of Travis County and most of Central Texas for that matter. They do have excellent fall color, and that's one of those few trees like cedar elm or flameleaf sumac that you can rely on for fall color each year.
I think that one of the prettiest sights I've ever seen in the fall in Texas, and it's funny because it was at Lost Maple State Park, was a Texas ash. Very beautiful tree. The western soapberry is one that is super tough. It's very well well, again, widespread native plant.
Right.
What's its rate of growth, though? I'm not familiar.
It's actually fairly rapid. And this is a tree that will regenerate really easily on its own. I often see western soapberry along the green belts in clusters. So you'll see that a tree has dropped seed and dozens of them have germinated and are taking off all by themselves in that, compacted, harsh growing environment where there's no supplemental water.
Right.
So they're pretty tough, and they also have fall color.
Okay, and deciduous, obviously.
Yes.
Right. So the western soapberry is another one for people to consider.
Yes.
Now you brought in, and I know you've done some planting projects in the Bastrop area.
Yes.
And this is a Loblolly Pine from that region.
Right.
So it's got that genetic stock, and there's a little bit of a difference in the Bastrop region, right, with these pines.
Right. The seeds that are endemic, that are native to Bastrop County, are different than those Loblolly pines that you would find in East Texas.
Right.
They are adapted to about 10 inches less rainfall each year. So their needle coating is thicker and waxier than those Loblolly pines in East Texas, and they also generally are shorter and have more fibrous root system.
Well, we've only given people a small taste of the different trees that are available for planting now.
Yes.
I hope folks will look you up online. TreeFolks, you have lots of great events, so I hope people will engage you that way.
Yes.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and coming up next, our friend Daphne.